Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to NDNA Talk event today. I'm Glenn Rothwell. I'm the membership manager at NDNA, so I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest event, which is included as part of your NDNA membership. Today, we've got an update from Citation, and Gillian McAteer will be covering managing sickness, absence, and statutory sick pay today. It is being recorded. And so the webinar will be made available for members to download afterwards if there's anything you want to go over again. You will have an opportunity to ask questions of our speaker during the session, and I believe Jill's going to try and address any questions during the session and at the end as well. Please can you use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And we do have some members of NDNA's team on the webinar as well today. If you need to contact anyone at NDNA with any questions, please use the chat function, which is again at the bottom of your screen. So just to remind you to ask the questions of our speaker Jill today, please use the Q&A function. And to ask anyone at NDNA any questions, please use the chat function. So Jill, if you are ready, I will pass over to you and we can crack on.
Thanks very much, Glenn, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, you are. I'm just trying to move the slides on. Yes, sorry, just in the session this afternoon, as Glenn says, I'm going to be looking at the SSP changes. I know we've already touched on that in a previous webinar, but we'll be looking in more detail at some of the issues which are arising as a result of those changes, and then giving some tips about managing sickness absence, some of the issues to be aware of. I know a lot of people are asked questions about, well, what is the stage that you actually should be taking action about sickness absence levels. And if we have time at the end, perhaps we can touch upon dealing with long-term sickness absence, because that is a real issue for many businesses these days. So the changes, just as a recap, I'm sure you're all very much aware of it. Probably one of the most impactful, certainly the most impactful of the first tranche of Employment Rights Act changes, which came into force on the 6th of April, is abolishing the requirement that to be eligible for SSP, you need to meet at least the lower earnings threshold, which is currently £125. So there's no earnings threshold on entitlement or eligibility for SSP. Obviously, it can't be more lucrative to be off sick than it is coming into work. So if it's a low paid earner, what they will receive is 80% of their average weekly earnings, or the rate of SSP, which is currently £123.25, whichever is the lower of those two amounts. The second very significant change is the scrapping of waiting days. That means that rather than having to wait for those first 3 days of sickness absence and then only getting paid from your 4th day of sickness absence, which really meant that although it was incredibly inconvenient to have people off sick and very disruptive to the business, it wasn't actually costing anything for those odd days here and there. This was actually, it's having an immediate cost now. So in addition to that, I should mention that the enforcement of SSP is changing as well. On the 7th of April, the Fair Work Agency got up and running. And so this is bringing all areas where the state gets involved in enforcement of certain employment rights. They're taking over national minimum wage enforcement, for example. They're taking over enforcement of regulations regarding agency businesses and gangmasters, etc. But they're adding 2 new areas where the state is going to get involved in enforcement of employment rights. One is SSP and one is holidays. Now, we are expecting a timetable to be published by the Fair Work Agency to say in what order are they going to start enforcing these new rights. We haven't had that yet. There has been a flurry of policy papers coming out from the government, and uh, reading in between the lines of those, we know that holidays is not likely to be enforced until at the earliest next year. We don't know whether they'll get around to looking at SSP enforcement this year, but at the minute, certainly the focus seems to be on the logistics of actually trying to get all these different agencies and put them under one umbrella. So that's what's taking up most of the focus at the minute. So I thought we'd just dive in to some of the questions we're being asked. Obviously, this is your opportunity to ask questions as well, but there will be opportunities later on. So, and really, one of the things to point out right from the very beginning is all the statutory sick pay legislation is actually almost it's HMRC legislation. It's the sort of thing which employment lawyers don't usually get involved with because, as I say, it's something which is normally these are payroll issues, and because it's all the legislation comes from HMRC, they're looking at everything from the view of a tax system which recognizes employees and the self-employed. Of course, from an employment law perspective, you'll know that there's actually three different categories of worker you can have. You can have people who are genuinely self-employed, not very common in the nursery sector, but then you have employees and workers. So these are people who you can call upon to do work from you from time to time on an ad hoc basis, but they are not on your payroll. They're not your employees. So they're called workers in law, but they come under lots of different titles. Let's just call them casual workers, just to reiterate the difference between an employee. Now, all the SSP legislation refers to employees. So you might be forgiven for thinking that, well, unless they're my employee, unless they've actually got a contract of employment, then I don't have to pay them SSP. Well, actually, employee in this context means an employee for the wider tax purposes. So the definition is of an employee is someone who is treated as an employee for those purposes, when in practice it's going to mean someone who's on your payroll and is an employed earner for tax and national insurance purposes. So that is a much broader category than just your employees. So these are some of the questions. I think some of them may have been asked on the last webinar we had. Can I withhold SSP if my employee doesn't provide me with a completed self-certificate for the first 7 days of absence? Now, later in the webinar, I'll be talking about some of the things, the practices you want to really make sure your business has got in operation if, to try and keep a handle on your sickness absence levels, especially in this new regime. And one of the core fundamental elements of that is make sure that if people are off, that they complete a self-certificate, because it's going to be very important for you to track the reasons for their sickness absence. And so that's normally a recommended part of any sickness absence policy. But can you say, well, you may have phoned in sick, but unless you need to complete the self-certificate, and actually until I get the self-certificate, you won't be paid SSP. Well, the answer to that is no. In fact, unfortunately, you can't do that, because the SSP regulations say that the obligation on the employee is just to notify you of that they're ill, and that's why they're not in work. That is meeting the obligation that they have in order to be paid SSP. However, if you have it as part of your policy that they should do this, you can then take, and they're not doing it. And obviously, there would have to be a discussion about why they're not doing it. And you want to be reasonable. And, for example, if they were too sick or had forgotten to complete the self-certificate, did it immediately as soon as it was pointed out to them, etc. As long as you take a reasonable approach, if they're consistently breaching your policy, just like any other policy, and they haven't got an acceptable explanation for that, then you can take disciplinary action. But disciplinary action would be your way around that, not withholding SSP. Another very common question we get is that, well, if I have got someone who only works 3 days a week and they take a week off, do they get 3/5 of what the flat rate of SSP is? And that's actually not the case. It is a weekly rate. So if you work 1 day a week, you'll get the 123.75 or whatever it is at the minute. Because if you're off sick on that day, that's a week off sick for you. And equally, if you are off, if you're off 3 days and you work 3 days a week, you'll get the full rate. But if you worked 1 day a week and if you worked 3 days a week, but you were off just 1 day, the daily rate of SSP is going to be a third of that 125 or whatever the current rate of SSP is. So if you're only working 1 day, it's the full rate. It's a weekly rate no matter how many days you work, but what a day's worth of SSP is worth to an employee will depend on the number of days. So you can see actually for people who work part-time, and it is more, a day's SSP is more lucrative to them, and the lower the number of days you work per week, the higher the daily rate of it. If someone comes into work and goes home partway through the day sick, how does sick pay work for that day? Now, SSP is only payable if you have done no work that day. So if someone comes in and within like the first 20 minutes, in the first 10 minutes, as long as they've started work, and if, they then are just too ill and have to go home, that's not going to be a day of work for SSP purposes. They'll be entitled to be paid for the work they've done, regardless, depending on how long they've worked, but it wouldn't be an SSP day. So it's got to be no work done at all that day. Then, this is a really thorny issue. Having 0 hours members of staff. And I've got to say that, this is really this is why I was quite lucky that for, the 30 years I've been practicing employment law, I've never had to spend any time really with the SSP regulations. And they haven't really come under much legal scrutiny because, as I say, it's been dealt with by HMRC. When you delve into the regulations, you've got to say you can see that there are some gaps here, and I think it possibly will need further guidance to employers and how they're to be interpreted. But let's look at this scenario, which I think it actually was a scenario came from our last webinar. We have a 0 hours member of staff that was due to come in on sorry, there's questions popped up. I'm minded to get distracted. Before I go into this big section on 0 hours workers, Michelle had a question there. Glenn, I don't know whether you can read that question because I can't see the chat, but it did pop up and I'm wondering, is it relevant?
Yes, so this is from Michelle. She says you've said that an employee who works 1 day a week is entitled to a full week SSP, which is referenced some other guidance online, which is of the 6th of April. The weekly rate is £123.25 or 80% of an employee's average weekly earnings, whichever is lower.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, I don't know whether Michelle missed the beginning of the webinar when I was saying what you get paid for what you get paid for SSP can't be more than you would have earned. So the rule is what you will actually be paid is the flat rate of SSP, £125 or other, or 80% of your average earnings, whichever is the lower. So what I was saying after that was subject to that caveat right at the very beginning of the webinar. Um, but yes, so going on to 0 hours workers, so you have got a member, 0 hours worker who was due to come into work on Thursday, but called in sick. Um, uh, so entitled to 1 day of SSP now. If she was then still poorly on the Friday, but actually wasn't due to work on the Friday, is that 1 day of SSP or 2 days of SSP? So essentially, that question there is Friday a qualifying day? Because a qualifying day are the days that you should be paid for SSP. So the way this works out is, and I've got to say, it's no comfort to you when you're trying to manage these situations in your business, but there is a lot of ambiguity between the Act and the regulations. Let me just start with where HMRC, apply it. They've got a manual which tells them what to do when they're trying to work out whether an employer has done the right thing or not. And their starting point is usually the days of the week on which an employee is required to work, be available for work, or normally work in their contract, are qualifying days. Now, that's not very helpful for 0 hours workers, is it? Because um, uh, you know you'll have maybe a rota that you've put on what to work, what days to work in a particular week, but that's not necessarily going to be the days when you expect them to be available for work. So this is when Regulation 5 kicks in. So what the rules essentially say, and I'll put this as simple as possible. You can agree in your contract what qualifying days are. Up until now, most employers I know have not done that because it was never an issue. I think there may well be a change going forward in relation to this. So let's assume you don't have something in your contract which says these are the qualifying days, and you don't have normal set working days. So then qualifying days in a particular week, so the days you have to pay them SSP in that week, the starting point is days it was agreed they would work that week. That's nice and simple. So in the case we've got, the manager can say, well, Friday wasn't a qualifying day because we'd agreed what days you were going to work. Friday wasn't one of them, so you don't get paid that day. So much, so straightforward. If it is a case where people work on a rota, but they're not necessarily guaranteed work on that day, but it is an ongoing, relationship you've got with them. It's just 0 hours, so you don't necessarily are going to give them work every week. You've not agreed that, say, this is a week in which they haven't been given any hours. They're still entitled to SSP, but the law says, well, we're just going to randomly choose Wednesday. That's the day, because you could have been given work. It was agreed you weren't going to be given any work that week, but you were still working for us. So Wednesday is what it's treated as. If there was no agreement, so for example, if you just hadn't thought about it, so if the rota hadn't been published for a week, what would you do then? So there's no agreement, you won't work. but equally there's no agreement that you'll work specific days. It's a variable hours contract or a 0 hours contract. What do you do then? What the regulation says is that every day would be a qualifying day, except days where no employees are expected to work. So if I put this in a nursery setting, say the nursery opens 5 days a week, if you haven't given them the set hours for that particular week that you expect them to work, but at the same time, it's not a week where you've told them they don't need to work. So it's a week where they probably would have been given some work had they been fit to work. Then every day, and the nursery is open Monday to Friday, 5 days are what would the qualifying days. Now, I've got to say, there is some ambiguity about that, because if we go back to the opening statement from the HMRC manual, it's saying where it does mention where they be available for work. So in practice, I think, so for example, you have got someone on a 0 hours contract, but they say, they can only work Monday to Wednesday. And so you and they both know that you can be given any day to work, but Monday to Wednesday. In practice, a lot of people treat that as, well, Monday to Wednesday are the qualifying days, not Monday to Friday, because we wouldn't be giving you work on the Thursday or Friday. It's not going to make any difference if they're off sick, for the week. But it's just, these are the background rules, which, as I say, these are really complex legislation. But are there any questions about that? Because it is, the normal rule of thumb would be it's when you are they'd be available to work. So if you've given a set rota and they know when they're supposed to be working, you follow that. If you haven't issued your rota yet, you'd look at what I think the days when they could have been offered work. We then had another thorny issue. We wouldn't want to miss this slide. Term time only workers. So we had a question the last time about term time only workers. What do you do about those? Now, the legal position, according to the SSP regulations, will depend on whether they are on a series of separate contracts for the term time. And again, I think this is where you see a big difference between what works in HMRC's mind and what works in the reality of employment law. I don't know. In my experience, most people will certainly wouldn't be talking about having contracts just for the term, and then they fall outside of it, and then they start a new contract, because you want to know you can rely upon people to be there, especially when some of the holidays between terms are relatively short. But if you're in a situation where literally people are employed on a contract to cover this term, and then they're out of contract, but may have agreed a completely separate contract for the following term, etc., the rules are different. So in that situation, I think I do wonder how common this would be, where, let's say, for example, it's summer. It's the start of the summer holidays, and they're on these set contracts just covering, so it's a series of contracts just covering the term time. If someone became sick at the start of the school holidays, they wouldn't be entitled to SSP because they're not in a contract at the minute. Their previous contract has just ended, So they're technically not on your books, they're not an employee, they're outside of contract, so they don't get SSP. If they became sick say 2 weeks before the end of the term before the summer holidays, they would get SSP up to the point that their contract was coming to an end. So by the time that term finishes, they're then outside of contract, so they would get paid SSP for those 2 weeks. If, for example, they became sick during the summer holidays, but had agreed the start, already had agreed the start of a new contract with you in September, but that's they still are sick from their sickness during the summer holidays, and maybe they're not going to be fit until the middle of October, they wouldn't be entitled to SSP for that period in September up until they are ready to start work, because they haven't started work on the new contract. And that's one of the rules of SSP. You actually have had to start work on the new contract to be entitled to it. So if you're ever unfortunate enough to employ someone and then day one they don't show up and they call in sick, you don't actually have to pay them for SSP if they haven't started work yet. If they call up on day two and they did work on day one, then you have to pay them. So that's how it works. It's basically you pay when they're in contract, and you pay, but you don't pay when they're out of contract. But even if they're in contract, if they haven't started work on that contract, you don't pay. If you have a term time only contract, but on a rolling contract, so your contract is you're going to do X amount of weeks in a year, and that is a continuing contract, then SSP continues during the holiday periods, even though they would not have that, even though it would have been a holiday period for them. So that's the difference from it. So have we got any questions about any of that, or any other questions about SSP before we look at actually what do you do when you're trying to keep sickness absence under control within your business?
Doesn't look like it at the moment, Jill. So everyone's getting the information. Oh no, there we go. As soon as I speak,
Yeah,
what's popped
yeah,
up in
I
the
guess.
chat.
I can read the
So
beginning of it, but we
all
are
right, you
term
can't.
time only. We have term time only, but then it cuts off. So Glenn,
All
if you
right.
could just, yeah.
So if a team member is off sick in the summer holiday but returns in September, do we pay SSP in August?
If they have a contract with you which stipulates these are this is when you're working, but uh, it's one contract, so yes, you would have to pay it. Um, if it is a situation where at the end of the summer term that contract comes to an end, and in September they're starting a new contract. So they're off your books for the summer and then they're starting a new contract in September, you wouldn't have to pay it. Now, again, I do wonder how practical that is for most businesses when you do need to have continuity, because, of course, when they're off your books and you're out of contract, there's no guarantee that you are going to have them. That's why people are kept on these continuous contracts. So I don't think this bit of SSP legislation is really realistic with what happens in practice, but that's how it works.
So there's a couple of other questions coming in related to the holiday. So Chantel has asked if someone's on holiday and said they were sick, do you have to pay SSP? And then I think related to that, Kimberly said, how do you know they are sick? They are away from work.
So if they're on holiday and they say they're sick, now there's a couple of things. It's settled law that if I take 2 weeks holiday, if I'm actually on holiday, and getting holiday pay, or getting paid for it. Um, I'm supposed to be relaxing, enjoying myself. If actually I'm sick when I'm on holiday, I can stipulate that the holiday is taken at a different time, and choose to get. I mean, in most cases, you're going to be getting SSP rather than your holiday pay. You don't have the employee doesn't have to do it, but if they're saying, "Look, I'm on holiday, but I just couldn't enjoy it. I'm supposed to be on holiday, but I I can't enjoy it because I'm sick, and I want to take the holiday at a different time," then that's something that they can request. There is no way of proving it. I've seen cases where that's happened, and it was probably just a ruse. They weren't particularly concerned about what they were getting paid. They just wanted to squeeze a little bit of extra holiday into it, and it's very difficult to disprove that. But that is something that they can do. But obviously, if that's the employee's choice about whether they want to move the holiday or not.
Okay, and there's one more. If you work on a rota and they are turn time only, so they are aware that they have no hours to work in the summer, and also under no obligation to work, do you still have to pay SSP?
It depends on whether or not you have an ongoing relationship. Again, I think this is where SSP rules are quite different from employment rules. So if you are a 0 hours worker and you have got this continuous relationship with them. So um, uh, I don't know whether, because we talk about 0 hours workers, and they can be people on contracts of employment. Um, so it's basically, you're my employee, but you'll just do the work as and when I give it to you. That's one thing, and that's a continuous arrangement. But you can also have casual workers where you're saying, well, you're not my employee, but we've got this relationship. So I'm giving you a workers agreement which says that from time to time I'm going to be offering you work. Now, in both situations, you have got a continuing relationship with that particular individual, and and if you have that, um, it will depend on how you're going to be paid. So, for example, say if you have, if you, I think the rules are, um, for someone who is a 0 hours worker with an ongoing relationship, if they've had that relationship with you for at least 3 months, and they for at least 3 months, and they say they're sick, they will be entitled to SSP. If they have less than 3 months, then they're only entitled to SSP for what they've specifically agreed to work for you. The HMRC have got special rules for 0 hours workers, and that broadly is what it is. So you're getting a bit more into the kind of payroll side of things, but broadly it all goes about whether you've got this continuing relationship and how long you've had it for. So, for example, and that 3 months cannot be broken, but just because you haven't given them any work, or because they were sick, or because they were on holiday. So the fact that you have got this continuing relationship but have chosen actually not to give them any work for like maybe a month and a half or something, as long as that relationship is intact, and it's been over 3 months, they'll be entitled to it. But and then what the days they would get paid for would go back to what the qualifying days are. So which we discussed earlier. So you can see it's a real minefield, and it's I think it's very often in conflict with what we understand from an employment law perspective.
Thanks, Jill. I think there's just one more if you've got time before you move on
Yeah.
to the next bit. So Beth has asked if the term time only staff member who is on an ongoing contract is off sick over the school holidays. They don't inform them that they are sick because they weren't due to be working. Where's the company stand from that point of view?
Well, I think one of the few basic rules is that they have got to tell you they're sick. So if they don't tell you you're sick, then there's yeah, they can't be treated as sick.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Yeah,
thanks, Jill. And just a reminder to everyone watching, if you can use the Q&A function to put your questions in, that'd be great. It's just easy for Jill to see them, and she can answer those directly. Right, I'll let you get back to it then.
thanks. So it's there's so many reasons why you want to, especially I think in your sector as well. It's like massive headaches to have sickness absence out of control, and it always has been a major issue for the sector. Just generally speaking, though, I think that's got considerably a more serious issue, not just for your sector, but across the board over the last few years. We have seen the number of cases of advice we've got to give on sickness absence problems increase from a very steady 7%, across like 10 years up to now 15% and still rising. So in that particular case, obviously, with these changes combined as well. So for example, there's all sorts of areas in which it could be subject to abuse in a way. So for example, people who previously might have needed emergency time off for dependents. Maybe their child couldn't go to school or something like that, who would have been entitled to take the time off, no problem at all. With that, that's their entitlement. But it's emergency time off for dependents is unpaid. Normally there wouldn't have been an issue with that, because if they'd taken the day off as sickness absence, and rather than saying, look, I've got this problem and that's why I need the day off, there would have been no incentive to say, oh, actually, I'm sick and I can't come into work, because each one would have been unpaid. This way, the day off sick would have been captured by the waiting days. Now, of course, with getting paid day one, it does mean that some people may be tempted to say, well, actually, I'm fine, but if I actually say that I'm the one who's sick, then I'll get paid SSP. So actually having these really robust processes will help. And these are the key elements to it. Having a really clear reporting process. We'll go on to talk about these in a bit more detail. Having accurate records of not just the days of absence, but the reasons for sickness absence. Carrying out return to work interviews, creating the right culture for these health conversations, because this can be really, really difficult. And there was a big report that was published at the end of last year, which they're continuing to update, about Keep Britain Working, which found that this was a real issue in managing sickness absence in businesses. And then, of course, the key question, because you can do all the right things and someone persists in taking time off, and it may be genuine, but it may be at a level that is just not sustainable for the business. And what do you do then? I mean, I remember years ago speaking to a nursery owner who was saying that he was caught in this terrible cycle of the fact that he had really high sickness levels, and knew he should be doing something to tackle that, but he also had really quite poor retention as well. So he didn't feel he could take disciplinary action against the people who were off sick all the time, because he was so hard pressed to find people and keep people, that he felt like he was almost putting up with it, but it just seemed to be getting worse and worse. And of course, not tackling sickness absence really can affect your retention figures as well. Because if you are someone who wants to come in and do your best every day, but your colleagues are going off sick all the time, then it's very tempting that you're either going to think, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and like they'll start doing the same, or they'll say, well, why should I be always having to pick up for other people? I'm going to go somewhere else where I don't have to have that. So you end up like in a really quite serious situation there. So looking at the clear reporting process, again, look at what it actually, well, first of all, look at what it says in your policy, and then look at what's happening in practice. They can be sometimes very different things. So everyone should know who to contact, when, and how. Ideally, employees should call in personally. We get lots of questions these days about, oh, I want to change my policy. So it's, people WhatsApping and things like that. Now, it is your policy, and as long as it's not overly onerous, I think there's great advantages of WhatsApp because it gives managers really early notification of it, at a time when it would be socially not acceptable to phone in the middle of the night. Says someone is really wakes up really unwell. No, they're not going to be available for work. WhatsApp or other type of messaging can be really helpful as a first notification because it means that the manager is going to see it as soon as they're up and about. So I think that works, but also to say that speaking to them as well is helpful because it can be very easy sometimes just to send a message off and not actually that's easier than having a conversation with someone. So think about that element in your policy. Of course, if you have a policy like that which requires you're going to apply it reasonably. So if someone has lost their voice, that might be a reason not to phone in. Sometimes, I mean, we see so many issues with, and what will be in the background to all of the things we're talking about here are the sickness absences, which are caused, the underlying cause of it is some mental or physical health condition, which has a substantial impact in the way they carry out their day-to-day life, which has lasted or is likely to last for at least 12 months, because that's disability territory. So, for example, if someone sent a message but said, I didn't phone in because I was struggling with my mental health and, I just couldn't face a conversation. And, they fell into that category of someone who's got a long-term mental health issue. That might be something that you would have to make a reasonable adjustment for in your policy. Again, good to take advice on all of those sorts of situations. Tell them what information you'll need to know when they do phone in. Now, again, I think we've had lots of questions from managers who are trying to tighten up on this and wanting a script of what the manager should ask. I mean, I've even seen one client who took a return to work interview and kind of adapted that and was having the manager ask all of those questions. That's far too much. I'm not even a big fan of a script or anything. I think once you start following scripts, you are not really engaged and fully listening to the employee. But I think it's important that you find out, first of all, what's wrong, and get an idea, obviously, because you'll need to know it from resourcing about, do they think that they're going to be in tomorrow? If they're not sure, can they maybe update you later on that day? But, being sympathetic. So it's all about trying to get the information. If they're not following reporting procedure, as I say, that's definitely something that can be the subject of disciplinary action. Very often you'll find, and again, well, we've seen lots of businesses that because of the SSP changes, they are coming down hard on things which actually they tolerated a huge degree of people not following the policy, and now they want to start making sure that it's enforced properly. But what I'd say is, if you think things have been done, um, in ways against your policy, or if you haven't had a policy, now is the time to draw the line in the sand. Um, so if it's things which, if whether it's a reminder, this is what should be done, and if this isn't followed, there may be further action taken. Or if it's, well, I'm rolling out this new policy, that's absolutely fine. But you've got to be mindful of the fact that what's happened before, you need to make it clear that there's now a change and things need to be done differently. Your reporting, your records of sickness absence are going to be hugely important here. So you need to make sure that you're recording the sickness absence and the reading for it. And that's why it's so important that employees complete these self-certificates, even if they've just had a day off. So not only do you have a record of the reason for the sickness absence, but you have a record that they have committed to. So, if you have someone who, there's no wriggle room in the future from going, oh, well, that wasn't sickness or whatever. They're actually committing to the fact that, this was the reason for their sickness absence. And it's also very important for you as well, because if when it comes to disability issues, which is now the biggest, we see the biggest increase in claims nationally in employment law claims is on disability discrimination issues. To be liable for a disability discrimination claim, the starting point is you need to have known or ought to have known that the employee had this, potential disability. So if you, and that's why you need it. So if they're phoning in all the time and telling their manager they've got a problem with their back or they've got a problem with their mental health, but this isn't being tracked in the records and you've got visibility to it, and then you do something in the future, which then they say is disability discrimination, and you say, oh, well, I didn't know that you had that disability. If they've been reporting these things to managers and it's just not been documented somewhere, you'll still be liable. So that's why it's so important that you have a record of it. So then when it comes to the stage of wanting to take action, you know exactly what the risks are and how the best way of going about that is. The return to work interviews. I know it's really, really difficult to stick with this, because I think these policies and practices have got to be something which works for you in your working environment. And I mean, I've not worked in a nursery, but as a manager, I know that when you are really busy, and especially when you're dealing, let's be honest, with people who were genuinely off ill, if you're busy, it's very easy to get into the habit of not going through these return to work interviews. But if you don't, then first of all, you won't have all the information you need. But secondly, you'll fall into potentially this discrimination element of you're only having return to work interviews, quite frankly, with people you're a bit suspicious of, or you have a group of employees that you're not doing it for because you completely trust them, and then you're doing it for other people. And any sort of inconsistency is absolutely dynamite for employees when they're trying to find a claim against you. So make sure that you get into the habit, and everyone in the business is getting into the habit to do it, because it helps you identify these patterns. And actually, it's not all about, I mean, I know I'm kind of focusing on this a lot, of how you're building all the materials you need to take action against people. Let's look at it in the best case scenario. This is an opportunity to see how you can help them in a way which is actually going to reduce their sickness absence in the future, because that's really the goal, isn't it? The fact that you may be able to take action against them if their sickness absence doesn't improve isn't as good a position of actually understanding the reason that they were sick. Is there anything you can do to help support them? And if so, that could help you in the long run. There is a case, if we've got time, I'll talk about it later on, where, for example, it was a cleaner in a hospital, and she was struggling with a certain working pattern, and if they had a conversation with her, a proper conversation with her, and had agreed that working pattern, that would probably have sorted all the problems. The reason why I note that is because they ended up dismissing her and then took her on as a bank worker, but under that new pattern, and she was completely reliable. That case did not end up well for those employers, which I'll explain later. So yes, this is an opportunity to, first of all, see if there's a pattern, discuss underlying issues. If they've not been following, if they, phoned in late, or you had to chase them for the self-certificate, it's a chance to remind them of what they're supposed to be doing. Good to have it. I mean, it always has to be held in a private setting. Good to have it on the first day back, as early as possible, really, and good to have a written record of it. I mean, I'm quite relaxed about when that written record is given. And again, I think it needs to fit in with what works best for the manager. For me, especially because there is usually a standard return to work interview form that you'll be working from. If they suddenly start to talk to you about something very personal, I'll be making notes, but I won't necessarily be completing the form, because I'll be more focusing on what they're saying and how I'm going to respond to it. So I'll have a note. So actually, the completion of the form I might do later and then send to them, as long as it is pretty quick, quickly afterwards. It's not something you sit on. So I think, again, it's more about the quality of that interaction as opposed to just a form ticking exercise. And of course, it is an opportunity to flag, oh, well, actually, this is the number of sickness days absence you've had. So, we may have to look at it further if there are further absences. So it's kind of like a bit of a warning flag that they really need, that you have noticed how much time that they've taken off. But this culture of fear, which the Keep Working report felt, was that there was issues. There was fear on both sides, really, on employees and manager sides, and that was meaning that they were keeping a distance at the very time when they needed to be creating a good dialogue most to actually achieve low sickness absence levels. So managers were afraid of talking, of saying the wrong thing, and worrying that was maybe going to end up in a grievance or escalate into a tribunal. That was, I've got to say, probably, in some cases, well-founded fears, because again, this report found that the average cost of sickness absence in the UK was £85 billion a year, but only 10 billion of that was actually in sick pay costs. Actually, what was it was obviously things like disruption to the business, but also the time spent, including in claims, of dealing with issues which arise, such as grievances, resignations, tribunal claims from these conversations going badly. And then employees are worried that if they disclose something, their manager's not going to see them in the same way again. It's going to be held against them. It's going to, in their future work. So you want to try and work to remove that as much as possible, by encouraging people to be open about their health. Now, having regular one-to-one times with managers, I think, is very important. And that is so important to so many areas of good HR management, because if you have that, if they've got one-to-one time, that helps build trust in the relationship. And then trust in that relationship is a real cornerstone to things like good employee engagement, good employee retention, better productivity, better performance at work, and lower absence levels. So they all stem from them having an opportunity to spend some time when it's just, how are you, how's it going, and not just solely focused about their performance in work all the time. And you can actively support things such as World Mental Health Day, but make sure that your managers are on board and know what to do with that, because it's the worst thing is that if people are encouraged to speak about their mental health, and a manager doesn't know how to have that conversation. Training managers on how to have difficult conversations. For me, with years of experience of dealing with managers in this, I think the number one tip I would say is, to help them have the conversation, is to recognize that if they feel awkward about having it, one, that is perfectly normal. I don't know any one of us who actually relishes having a conversation with someone about something as sensitive as their health. But two, that is stemming from the fact that they don't want to upset them. They want this to be a positive conversation. They want to help. So actually, the fact that you feel a bit awkward about it doesn't mean that you're going to make a mess of it. If anything, it's a sign to me that you really want to help them. So giving them a couple of open questions that you can give them to start the conversation rolling, can give them that confidence. And if they're in any doubt about it, speak to someone else about what they should be saying. I think it's with your managers, conversations about absence levels in their teams should always be part of the one-to-ones that you have with them as well, so that they become more comfortable discussing that with you. They know that it's something which is being scrutinized by the business, and they can also ask for advice on how to deal with a particular situation. Now, escalation. This is a big thing of, well, when is too much absence something that you should actually move to the next level? So first of all, I would say you need to know what your absence levels are across the board. Someone said to me the other day that they had a client who wanted to introduce, I'll talk about trigger systems in a minute, but they wanted to introduce a trigger system where if you had 3 days absence, that was going to be a letter of concern. Then if there was another day's absence, it would be first written warning. Then if there was another day's absence, it would be a final written warning. And then another day's absence after that would be dismissal. Well, if you take a step back from that, that's going to cause, quite apart from the fact that it's probably going to be seen as entirely unreasonable by a tribunal, but the average, according to last year's CIPD survey, the average absence in the private sector for UK employees is 9.4 days. Now, I was really surprised when I read that, although not when I think of the amount of questions about sickness absence we get, because for years, I was always quite surprised at how relatively low the absence level was. It used to be, several years ago, it used to be under 5 days. Pre-pandemic, it was 5.8 days. back in 2023, it was 7.8. So if that's the average, you've got to think about the level at which you're going to be taking action. So I think your starting point is to know your business average. If you've got, you should be able to get that information from your employee absence management system. So know what your business average is, and then look at the people who are above that. And if you think everyone is above, that 9.4 days, you might need to look at actually imposing some of these practices and then reviewing it and see has it caused improvement. Again, in my experience, once you start to really proactively manage it and be scrutinizing it quite carefully, and any of those steps tend to bring an improvement in absence levels. So, and also with these cases, it can be very tempting to say, well, I want to impose something which is going to treat everyone the same, because that must be fair. If everyone is subject to exactly the same rules, that must be fair. And actually, that's not the case, because it's not, as an employer, and this goes for any area, not just sickness absence management, it's not about treating all cases the same, it's about treating like cases the same. So doing what is fair on the facts of that particular case, and then in similar cases treating it the same way. But the first step, once you've identified that someone has got an absence level which you think is unsatisfactory, is you have a review meeting with them. This is absolutely key, to say, look, this is your absence record. And again, if you've had the return to work interviews, if you've had them completing self-certificates, if you know what the company average is, you have got all the tools you need to feel comfortable in having that meeting. So saying, this is the number of days you've had absence. These are the number of instances of absence you've had. These were the reasons. This is in excess of what is normal for the business. Is there any underlying reason behind it? Now, if you've got them to complete the self-certificates and you've had the return to work interviews, that will be something that you will have looked at first of all, but still ask the question. So for example, if you find that 80% of these absences are because of a bad back, we could potentially be in disability discrimination territory. So you need to be very careful about that, but ask for their explanation. If you're dealing with a situation where they say, and it is just all random reasons, and it's like, well, I can't help it if I keep getting colds or something like that, then it's got to be, well, look, this is at an unacceptable, depending on how severe it is and depending on any warnings you might have given them previously. It's a good idea to give what we call like a letter of concern, saying this is your sickness absence levels. That is running at a level which is unsustainably high for the business, causing lots of disruption. So we need to see, we discussed, there was no underlying reason for that. Always good to get that confirmed in writing, that you've had that discussion. There's no underlying reason. And, we'll expect to see, a very significant and sustained improvement, or there may be a disciplinary action. And then, make sure that you follow up on that. So just because they have one day off doesn't mean to say you'd necessarily jump on it, but and again, I would take advice, but you've set it up there to go to a first written warning for absence. In relation to, I don't know whether I moved those slides on, or did they?
Just before, I thought you were about to move on there, Joe. I wonder if it was just a good time just to have a look at some questions that have been
Oh, of
popping up
course. Yeah,
that are
absolutely.
relating to some of the things you've been talking about. You should be able to see them now in the Q&A function. So thanks
Let's
to
see.
everyone for putting them in there. So the first one says, I use yearly contracts like some schools. I don't have to renew if I decide sickness, and I think she says means mental health sickness is high. Um, is that an issue?
Yes, it potentially could be because if I'm saying that the reason my contract has not been renewed is because of my mental health issues, and which is classed as a disability. I mean, not all mental health issues are long term, but most are. So if that's the reason you haven't had a contract renewed, that would be disability discrimination. So the onus would be on you to say it had absolutely nothing to do with. So, for example, if a contract wasn't renewed because of funding or something completely objective and outside of your control, and you've got the evidence to do that, to substantiate that, then that would counter the argument that it was because of their their disability. But if the reason you're doing it is because of their unacceptable sickness absence level, and that the reason for that sickness absence level is their is a disability, that is disability discrimination.
Okay, so thanks. Hopefully that answers your question there, Emma. If you need further clarification, please just type in there again. And the next question that came up, I think it was at the point you were doing the section on return to work
Yeah.
interviews about are they required? Correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, it doesn't say the name on here. The return to work interviews are they only for paid for sickness, i.e., not a day off to look after someone, appointment uh, in emergency, etc. I think that's what you're referring to at that around that time anyway.
Yes, I would treat it as sickness because if it's uh, they are specifically, certainly our templates are specifically designed around sickness absence because that's going to be the most common type of absence. If you had a situation, and again, you need to tread carefully, but if you had a situation, for example, where the amount of time off for dependents was becoming really disruptive to the business, um, you could have a meeting, an informal meeting, to have a chat about that to see whether or not, is there anything that it could help. So, for example, sometimes a change of hours can help if this is going to be a problem that crops up time and time again. You have to be very careful when dealing with time off for dependents because that's a protected statutory right. But that wouldn't be used in your normal absence return to work form. No, because that was a one-off that was separate.
Thanks, Jill. So we'll just cover the next couple before we move on. So we've got the are the new SSP rules stroke no waiting days now set forever, or will they change when we have a change of government?
Well, they could they could change. Nothing is set. You can't say this is going to be set on stone. It was interesting when it came into the change in rules on unfair dismissal that the government have tried to do their best to set those in stone because they've said if you want to change the service requirement for unfair dismissal again, that can't be done by regulation. That's got to be done by a full-blown act of parliament. That has marked something they've tried to say we're going to make it as difficult as possible to change it. That's not been done for SSP. But what I would say is, no matter how unpopular things may seem at the time they're introduced, once they are in operation, it's actually very, very difficult to get rid of them. So, for example, if when national minimum wage rules were introduced, that was, I think, very short. It might have been 97 when the Labour government came in, around about that time, I think. That was like, this is the end of the world, this is going to be overturned. And of course, by the time a new government comes in, the rules are in operation. And and there's not been any argument about reminding it. Where I think you will see a change, perhaps, is in this guidance on how these rules apply to 0 hours workers, because I think that is the area where there's still a lot of confusion. It's not really fitting with what you, as an employer, the whole point of having casual workers is you don't have that continuing obligation. And that's where these regulations are not fitting quite easily. And previously, that wasn't a problem because most of it was captured either by the fact that they weren't earning the lower earnings level, or they were being caught up by the waiting days. So I think that's possibly where we'll see some change, not just by a future government. Maybe this government will look at it.
Thanks, John. I think Kimberly sort of made the observation of just how detrimental these rules could be on nurseries in particular.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I don't think there's an easy answer we can provide to the last point that Kimberly's made there about how you're supposed to financially juggle all these issues as a nursery owner. But it's something that NDNA obviously campaigns on and highlights these issues to the government. And it's just finally a question there from Betty, which is about the trigger meetings. So you might be about to talk about this.
Yes.
So she says, can we request self-certification forms from day one, and who would conduct the trigger meetings? So
Yes.
I'll leave you to that, and I'll finish there, and you can crack on after you've addressed that one.
Yes, well, absolutely. You can ask for self-certificates from day one. The only thing that can be part of your policy, I would really encourage it to be part of the policy. But just to be clear, if someone was off sick for 3 days, they need to complete a self-certificate, but I wouldn't necessarily be I don't think it would be reasonable to say you complete a self-certificate the first day of your sickness absence, because you might not have access to the systems, and you might be too unwell to complete it. And anyway, you want that self-certificate to actually cover the amount of time they were off. So, but if it's just one day, absolutely, you can ask for it. For very important for it to be capturing those random days with the self-certificate. In terms of the trigger meetings, we'll just come on to chat about that now, because this is trigger systems. Some of you may have them in place, some of you may not, but the idea is that it's at a certain point there will be a system that comes into force where you've had so many absences, some action is going to be taken. Now, some of those policies, if you think about the client that I was talking about earlier, who wanted to be very prescriptive and said, right, X number of days sickness absence, you're going to get a warning. That's not really how it should be applied. The trigger really should be about triggering escalation, not a particular outcome. Some can be points-based systems like the Bradford factor, where it's how many days over a specific period. In practice, I think you want something which is going to be easy for your managers and your employees to understand. Very often, I will say that these trigger systems can be played by employees as well. But the important thing is that it's an escalation. It's not a warning, because that's where you get into really sticky problems with these. Now, the reason why it's a good idea to have a trigger system is it answers that question of, when do I escalate this? At what point is an employee's sickness absence at a level where I need to be taking further action? That's a really difficult issue for managers. And so to have that in a trigger policy, it gives managers a real framework. And it also gives, business owners a framework of saying, right, this is, why haven't you done something about this? So that's really helpful. And it also helps to achieve a consistent approach amongst managers. And it also lets employees know that, okay, well, at this particular point, it's going to be escalated. So they know it, that that's the case. So, and it does have that greater sense of fairness because it's being applied across. And it also, as I say, that trigger system, if it's triggered early, means that you're getting early intervention and not waiting, as in some cases where it's absolutely just an atrocious sickness absence level. So those are all really positive things about a trigger system. Um, there are risks about it as well. Um, if we talk about uh, where we see most claims coming from it, is where managers don't treat it as a this trigger is a telling me that I need to escalate it and look at what should happen next. Very often managers want to follow it blindly because and say, right, this means I need to start the ball rolling for a first written warning, when that is not necessarily where it needs to go. Um, Managers have got a hugely difficult time. Anything that makes their life easier, it's very tempting to go down that route. So there's a lot of pressure that they will say, right, this is just like, once you hit the first trigger, there's going to be a warning. And then if you hit another trigger, there's going to be another warning without actually doing the work that you need to at each stage. And then if we talk about, if we go back to what I was saying about, look, if your aim is to reduce sickness absence, which of course it is, these return to work interviews, these conversations about health, shouldn't just be seen as a form ticking exercise you do so you can build the evidence you need to use against people in the future. There should genuinely be an opportunity to say, look, what can we do to help you? Is there anything we could do to help you to reduce your sickness absence levels in the future, to make sure that you're in work? And sometimes these trigger systems can move you more into the process box ticking exercise than having those proper conversations. Um, Also, I mean, the biggest risk of this is going to be in relation to discrimination. So it needs to, if we think about what I was talking about, informal processes before, once you know something may need to be escalated, then it's a question of having a meeting and saying, look, is there any underlying cause? Because if there is an underlying cause, you shouldn't just adopt your normal trigger systems. If there is an underlying cause which is linked to their health, a long-term health issue, you might need to go into the territory of an occupational health report, a report from their doctor to understand what issues they're experiencing, any reasonable adjustments. Not getting that right is one of the areas where we see most claims coming from. And it's really applying triggers when there are long-term health issues is almost handing an employee an easy claim against them. It doesn't mean to say that if you have got someone who's got a long-term health issue, that you're just then having to put up with whatever sickness absence level they've got. That's not the case at all. It just needs to be dealt with in a different way than the trigger system. Um, so this is the case that I was referring to earlier, which is a good example of where trigger systems can go wrong. So a case from last year, which went to the EAT, and it was a hospital, it was a health trust. So of course they have like a big HR team, they've got policies coming out of their ears, they've got no reason to get this wrong, but it just shows you how complicated these things can be, the fact that they did get it wrong in this particular case. A bit of a spoiler alert there, although I gave a spoiler alert earlier. So it was a cleaner employed for 4 years, and in those 4 years she'd had 406 days of absence over 29 periods. A lot of those absences were linked to her mental health. Now they applied a trigger system and they gave several warnings about her attendance, but so it wasn't as if they completely rushed her through a trigger process. There had been warnings. They had tried to make some adjustments for her, but eventually she was dismissed. And well, I asked the question fair dismissal, but I think probably you know from my previous comments that it's not likely to be a fair dismissal. It wasn't. And she got just short of £50,000 in damages. And where they'd gone wrong is that they had failed to make what the tribunal, and this was confirmed by the AT, had been reasonable adjustments around the triggers. So be flexible, but be as flexible as you can, and then have a good reason as to, well, look, this is just we can't continue to do this anymore. Often when you look at these cases, the manager making the decision to dismiss has been very, as you would be. I mean, if you're thinking of dismissing someone for sickness absence, you're normally sitting on a big stack of absences and that's what you're looking at. And it's all very much the focus is on the historical sickness absence. And that is often where these disability discrimination cases go wrong, because whilst, of course, the historical absence is why you're there, why you found yourselves there in the first place, when you make the decision to dismiss on a trigger basis or anything else, you should also, where there is a disability involved, you should be looking at the future. What is future absence going to be like? So, for example, if it was someone, let's say it was someone who had service, who could bring a claim for unfair dismissal and had some, even they may not even qualify as a disability, but just in principles of fairness, if their sickness absences were caused by something, not a disability, but something which had been rectified by having surgery, maybe they had a hernia that had been causing lots of problems, but now they'd had an operation and that had been cured. Just because they've had a really high level of sickness absence, when it comes to making the decision to dismiss, you wouldn't be thinking, oh, well, they've met all the triggers. You'd have to factor in, well, what's their future sickness absence going to be like, given that fact? And then it may be that you would, rather than dismiss, you might want to give them a final warning, an extended final warning, perhaps if they're already in a final warning, to see if this brings an improvement. It's all very easy for employees after the event to say, when they're facing you in tribunal, to say, aha, but after that, my absence levels would have been impeccable because all that was sorted out. So not focusing just on the past, but on the future, what their future attendance is probably the best way to protect yourself, and making sure that you are taking account of these long-term health issues and going for occupational health or a doctor's report if there's something there. As I say, that's the fact you've recognized there is an underlying issue and you're treating it differently is really helping to show that you have made reasonable adjustments. So I think that might be where I think we've got 2 minutes left. So if you are going to have a trigger system, look at it as something which is a point of escalation as opposed to ending in a warning. But it should always be a review meeting, adjust it as necessary, and not make sure that it leads to automatic warnings. If you've got a trigger system in place, I would suggest make sure that you're following those principles. If you haven't got a trigger system in place and you're thinking, well, that sounds great because then everyone knows where they stand. What I would say is, have you got the basics? Are you doing the basics already? So if you've got self-certificates being completed, if you have got return to work interviews happening, and managers know what they're supposed to be doing with sickness absence, and your absence levels are out of what you consider to be an acceptable range, then I think maybe a trigger system is a good next step. But if you're not doing any of those basics, just introducing a trigger system, to me, it sounds like a bit of a recipe for disaster, because you're not you're not going to have that fundamental management processes in place to do it. So I would be, I mean, again, it's obviously up to you, but my advice would be get the get those basic absence management processes in place, see where that leaves your absence level, and then if you're still not satisfied, a trigger system may be the next step, but you'll be building on a stronger foundation. So Glenn, I don't know whether we're at 25 minutes now, so I don't know whether there's any final questions there.
There we go. Just struggling with the audio button there for a second. It looks like there's only one question at the moment. So we've got a couple of minutes if there's anyone else who wants to raise any further questions before we end the session. So there's just one, I don't know if you can see it there, Jill from
Oh,
Kimberly. So it sounds like it's a specific question for citation, to be honest, about some of your processes.
I can't. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat. I don't know. It's
Sorry, it's on
disappeared.
the Q&A, this one.
Oh, yeah, I can't.
Can't see that
No.
either. All right.
Sorry.
So, at what point does someone record the absence with citation? Should they contact you before the first trigger meeting? So
Uh,
that's
I,
specific for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're there when you feel that you need advice. So, for me, for example, I would be saying, if the manager, if you're an advice card holder and you're concerned about how to handle this meeting, um, then that's that feeling as an, oh, I'm not sure how this is going to go, is a good instance of when you should be calling. There's no limit to the number of calls. No one's going to say, why are you bothering me with this? It's if you even if you as a manager you want to play it through to say, well, what if there's any curveballs in this and how would I deal with that? That's absolutely fine. But equally, we're not there to say, oh, you have to phone us. So as long as you have the meeting, if they're talking about long-term conditions, but you still want to give a warning, definitely take advice then, because if you start giving warnings, that can be a detriment in itself, and it could, so for example, don't think, well, I'm not sacking them, I'm just giving them a warning. Where's the harm? They could resign and claim constructive dismissal and say, oh, you didn't take into account my long-term health condition, so I've lost all trust and confidence in you, and I'm claiming constructive dismissal and disability discrimination. And you have something that then takes a lot of work to try and put back in the box, if you can even do that. So if you can see that there is a long-term health issue there and you're going into a meeting with the employee, good to get advice on how to handle it in advance so you're not finding yourself in that position.
Thanks, Jill. That's great. I know it's such an important topic, all of this for our nursery owners and managers. So we appreciate your time providing this advice. Before everyone goes, we just got a quick evaluation question for you to make sure that all our members feel like they are more informed and got some peace of mind from the advice that they've received. So there should be a poll just popping up on your screen there. If you could take just a few seconds to respond to that. How's this event made you feel more informed about statutory sick pay? Um, I know
I'll
I
not
am.
look at the results, so I'm not. You can be honest.
Well, yeah, some of it, the question should be, has this made you feel slightly more sick about statutory sick pay? But I think you definitely get a few yeses on that one. So thank you for everyone for attending. If you've replied to that poll, that's great. Thank you to Jill. Um, so just before you go, just a reminder that NDNA's conference is coming up in Liverpool in June. If you haven't booked on yet, please do so. Keep an eye out on all our social media channels for our updates on our guest speakers. We've got a great lineup already, but more will be announced shortly. Just a quick reminder as well, that there's been some guidance released by the DFE around safer sleep guidance. So NDNA has updated our safer sleep policy template. So we'll be sending an email about that shortly as well, but it's already on the website for you to download in the policies and procedures section. And a reminder that every member gets 200 online courses included in their membership. If you haven't already downloaded it, please do so. And just finally, this is our campaign to highlight the great work that nurseries do with our Nursery Where the Best Start Happens campaign. Please keep an eye out again for all our updates on social media and via email on those, and please take part in that. So I thought we got another question there, but it was a thank you, so that's great.
Oh,
So thank you to everyone. Thanks, Jill. We'll let you all go.
thank
Enjoy the
you.
rest of your afternoons. The recording will be up on the website shortly. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.